50% of the southern hemisphere.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Like out in the oceans, I mean, what do they do to get surface temperature?
What they used to do was throw a bucket over the side of the ship, get a sample of the water, pull it on board, and put a thermometer in the water.
Oh, yeah. And that's considered surface temperature.
That's right. They were doing that for a while. Then they started measuring it at the engine intakes on the ship's engine.
Oh, yeah.
Because they'd pull the ocean water in to help cool the engine. They separate the salty water from the rest of the system.
Yeah.
But they're measuring it there typically about once a day. They'd record what it was.
Yeah, so in fact...
But that could be a couple of meters below the surface, depending on how large a ship is.
So they're not really measuring surface air temperature over the ocean. They're actually measuring the surface temperature of the ocean.
Yes, most of the time we're talking about the sea surface temperatures.
Okay.
The funny thing is that usually at the same time, they are recording what the air temperature was.
Oh, okay.
That is in the big database they use, but no one seems to look at that. They only want the sea surface temperature data.
Huh. Now, is that very valid to put into a database that has land surface temperature?
Well, it's rather suspect because temperatures over land will vary from about minus 50 up to about 50 degrees.
Oh, okay.
Temperatures in the water, or the surface of the water, vary from about 0, or just below because it's salt water, like about -1, up to about 32 or 33 degrees.
Yeah.
So one varies by 100 degrees and the other one by about 33, 34.
So how do you put them together in the same database? Or should you?
They probably shouldn't because they're measured by such completely different methods. And, of course, the water can store a lot more heat than air can.
Mm-hmm.
So water warms more slowly, cools more slowly.
Now, I understand that you extended your PhD thesis into a book. Can you tell us about that and whether it's had some impact on the people who assemble the data set?
Well, I've extended the PhD work. I added a whole lot more forms of analysis of the data and ended up with about 70 major issues in the data set.
Okay. Is that readable by the average person, by the way?
Yes, it is. I made sure that everybody could read it.
Okay.
And everything was quite well explained.
Yeah, I'd love it if you'd send me a link. We can put the link right under the podcast.
Yes, I can certainly send you a link on that.
Yeah, what's it called, the book?
I could tell you right now.
Oh, okay.
It's I just reached over and picked up the book.
Okay.
An audit of the creation and content of the Hadcrut 4 temperature data set.
Huh. Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward.
But the amazing thing is that no one has previously done it, and if any government has done that, they've kept it very, very quiet.
It's such a basic thing to do with such an important field. Now, we're going to have to write on this, John. This is pretty incredible. So now I always find it interesting to ask people what triggered their conversion to a climate realist point of view. Now, obviously, your data would have done that, but I suspect that you were probably starting to question it even before you did the analysis.
Well, I had accepted what scientists were telling us. I'd never seen any reason to question it for a long time. But then in about 2003, I was working in Europe, and I took a trip to Greenland, a trip up the west coast. And at one of the old Viking settlements, the guide there told us that up on the ice cap, scientists were finding that temperatures in the past had been warmer than they were today.
Oh, yeah?
And even back in 2003, we were being told, oh, yes, it's never been this warm.
But you were saying evidence that it certainly had been, and more so.
So the guide's comments got me curious about that, and I did some investigation about 6 months later when I had some spare time, and found that what he said was correct. It had been warmer in the past, and the fascinating thing about the Greenland ice core data, it's saying that the last 600 or 700 years, have been the longest cold spell in the last 10,000 years.
Oh, yeah?
Since we came out of the, well, it wasn't really an ice age, but a very cold period.
The Little Ice Age, yeah.
Well, no, it's back beyond the Little Ice Age. We're talking about 10,500 years ago.
We came out of the last glacial, yeah.
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 It's probably about 1.5 degrees cooler.
Now, did they actually show you what happened to that colony? Because I know, they had the medieval warm period where they were actually growing grain and raising sheep in Greenland. But what actually happened to them as it got colder?
Well, the theory is that it got colder and it just was untenable to be farming there. So they moved. They might have moved back to Iceland. Perhaps they even came down to Vinland. But, it just seems that the temperatures changed so much, it was they just couldn't live there anymore.
Mm-hmm. So they didn't adapt the practices of the local native community.
I guess not. But that would have been a change from land-based agriculture to basically a sort of fishing and coastal form of living.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. It's an interesting idea of where they went and why they left.
Yeah. Now, you were saying in your little email to me here that you didn't do anything about this discovery until a little later in Australia. Can you tell us about that?
Well, what happened was I finished my work in Europe, came back to Australia, didn't immediately have a job, and it was curiosity more than anything else that motivated me to look into this data and see what I could find.
Yeah. Well, you're a data analyst, so that makes sense.
Well, it was once I found the data on the internet, it wasn't that difficult to start to plot it and see what it was telling us.
Yeah. Now, what was it telling us? I mean, outside of Greenland, was it showing a similar trend to what you saw there?
That's always a big question, Tom. When you have temperatures from one place, how wide an area do those temperatures reflect?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know if it was just for that part of Greenland. I don't know if it was all of Greenland, all of the Northern Hemisphere. But then the same things happens more recently because people look at a few trees in Russia or a few trees in the west of the USA and say, oh, yes, this was all the Northern Hemisphere had this kind of temperature.
Yeah, like I see this all the time. I went to a presentation with a glaciologist who showed the glacier was shrinking where he was doing his work, and he said, oh, this is a sign of global warming. And I put up my hand and I said, well, actually, it's not a sign of global anything. It's a sign that regional something was occurring. And, of course, glaciers can retreat for more than just temperature reasons. And he was quite offended. I think that's the problem, is you can't contest anything or even question it because you're somehow a denier. But, so when you started comparing it with other parts of the world, did you see the medieval warm period, the Little Ice Age? Did you see those kinds of trends? Or was it mostly just isolated in Greenland?
That's a very good question. What I have noticed is that the Antarctic didn't exhibit the same kind of temperature pattern.
Oh, okay.
It actually varied even more, but in a very sort of irregular way.
Uh-huh.
It was sort of up and down all over the place. And the medieval warm period wasn't particularly evident in the data from Greenland.
Yeah.
And yet we know that around about, let's say, 1100 AD, it was quite warm in Europe.
Yeah, because apparently they were growing grapes in much of England, and of course that's when they built the cathedrals, because it's easier to do so when it's not so cold. You know, generally speaking, I mean, tell me what you think of this. I mean, you live in a fairly warm climate. We live in quite a cold climate. It would strike me that cooling is probably a lot more of a problem than warming.
Oh, yes. There's been countless studies that show that more people die from the cold than die from the heat.
Mm-hmm.
And they've even showed that here in Australia.
Oh, is that right? You have parts of Australia that actually get cold?
Oh, we do. I mean, we have ski fields here in Victoria.
Oh, is that right?
And inland, away from the coast, even here in Victoria, it'll get down sort of -4, -5 in the mornings.
Oh, is that right? Huh.
I was working in one place some years ago, and it was -8
Huh.
that morning when I was trying to drive to work.
Yeah, exactly. And so, that sort of reminds me of Texas, their situation, where they relied too much on wind and solar power. And of course, the turbines froze. And interestingly, just a day or two before the cold hit, they lost almost all their wind and solar power. So the natural gas had to make up for not only the amount that they needed extra because of the cooling, but also to compensate for wind and solar essentially going offline. Is Australia following the same kind of silly green energy path that we're seeing here in North America?
Oh, absolutely, Tom. Just this morning, I was reading of plans to close another coal-fired electricity generation site early, like about 4 years earlier than planned.
Oh, yeah?
But why would any company invest in a coal-fired generation at the moment if government legislation is going to make them worthless within about 20 years?
Yeah, worthless financially, but from an energy perspective, they're super valuable. This is something I don't get. Because China, of course, is expanding their coal use hugely, and yet they're the biggest emitter, and yet we're supposed to reduce our coal use? I don't get that.
Well, for a long time, Australia was happily selling its coal to China, but at the same time subsidising wind farms and solar farms.
Yeah. Are you still sending coal to China?
We have a bit of an argument with China at the moment, and I think that's because we were closely aligned to the US in our thinking. And now that Biden is the US president, who will probably take a softer line on China, China thinks that Australia is the, if you like, the next pin that it wants to knock over.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well,
so things are a little bit difficult.
Yeah.
But I just find it bizarre that we are relying for our energy on the weather. We all know how fickle the weather can be.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, you can get 7 days with practically no wind, and there's no batteries that'll hold the charge for more than a few hours. I understand the world's biggest battery has been in Australia, but how much time can they actually hold the charge for? Surely it's not very long.
That's the battery in South Australia.
Uh-huh.
And that was where the wind turbines all suddenly shut down when the wind, or most of them shut down when the wind got too strong, and the surge in power that it had to import from other states was enough to trip a major connector, and the whole state was blacked out.
So that was because there was too much wind.
Too much wind. Yes, the wind turbines couldn't take it.
Wow.
So they spent a certain amount of money on this massive battery system. I don't think they've announced actually how much it cost. And I think it's perhaps 10 minutes of power at the most.
Oh, geez. Yeah, I heard in California this huge battery they're building would provide the power for California for, I think it's 110 seconds. So
yes,
it's not terribly effective. Well, John, it's been great talking to you. We'll continue our conversation next week. So thanks so much for being on today. And so
my pleasure.
Have a nice, I guess it must be fall for you.
It's fall.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, we'll talk to you again next week. Thanks a lot, John.
Okay, Tom.
Bye-bye.
Bye.